Welcome, GeoTrig. This is section 2-6, proving angles congruent. The essential question is not there. So the essential question is, well, how can you use given information and postulates to prove theorems? That's the essential question. Or make up your own. Let's go. Theorem. So what is a theorem? So a theorem is a conjecture or a statement that you prove true. So you're going to be seeing some theorems up here. It's something that we can actually prove true. So the way you want to prove a theorem is you can separate a hypothesis and a conclusion. The hypothesis is your given, and then the conclusion is what you actually prove. So given this, prove this. And we're going to use a two-column proof to prove a theorem. So let's look at the first theorem. So this is the proving the vertical angles theorem. This is like one of the first chapters where I said 1 and 3 are vertical angles, and then we're going to prove that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. So let's begin. So the first statement is our given, right? So I'm going to do statement 1. Angle of 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. Vertical angles. And the reason for number 1 is it is given. All right, let's do statement number 2. Statement number 2. Well, I want to get to the proof that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. So let's use angles 2 and 4 here. What we can do first is we can say, hey, angle 1 and 2 are supplementary because we got a straight line here. These two angles are going to add up to 180 degrees. So I can say angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary. And also, to add on to that, I can say angle 2, and angle 3 are supplementary. And the reason we can do this is that the angles form a linear pair. So angles that form a linear pair are supplementary. Because they got this line and the two angles form a pair that are supplementary. All right, so step number 3. Well, what can we do with this information? Well, we can use that supplementary, say measure of angle 1 plus measure of angle 2 add up to 180. We can say the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 3 also add up to 180, and that's because the sum of supplementary angles are 180. So we can say sum of supplementary, let's write that better, supplementary angles is 180. Alright, so let's do the next step, step number 4. Well, since they're both 180, we can do something else here. I can just combine those through the transitive property. I can go measure of angle 1 plus measure of angle 2 equals the measure of angle 2 plus measure of angle 3. And that's transitive property. That's saying those 180s kind of are transit just to combine these two equations. Transitive property. All right, the next step here, step number 5. Well, now that I have those equal to each other, well, we can get measure of angle 2 is on each side, so we can get rid of that. We can say measure of angle 1 equals the measure of angle 3. And why can we do that? Well, we subtracted. You subtracted measure of angle 2 on each side. So subtraction property of equality. Equality. All right, and my next step, step number 6, I can say, well, now that I know the measure of angle 1 equals measure of angle 3, I can convert that to congruent angles and say angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Why can I do that? Angles with the same measure are congruent. So I can say angles with same measure are congruent. I'm using a little shorthand here. You can do the same thing as long as it makes sense, or you can just write it all out. So that's how I can prove that. So it's, yeah, a lot of steps. It's going to be a lot of work for these kind of problems, and you might have to spend more time thinking about it, and you'll make mistakes, but that's okay. So that's one way to prove it. All right, so let's look at a different theorem here. Congruent supplements theorem. So this theorem states If two angles are supplements of the same angle, or of congruent angles, then the two angles are congruent. So what's that mean? If 1 and 3 are supplements, and 2 and 3 are supplements, then angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Alright, so let's prove that. Let's prove that. Use our proof here. So given 1 and 3 are supplementary and 2 and 3 are supplementary. So I'm going to start off with, sometimes you don't automatically start off with using both at the same time. So the first statement, I'm going to say angle 1 and 3 are supplementary. So that's given. Now step number 2, I can say the measure angle 1 and, oh, let's do and, let's do plus the measure of angle 3 equals 180. And I can say this because supplementary angles add to 180. So sup angles add to 180. Alright, step number 3, I can say, well, I guess I can just add angle 2 and angle 3 are supplementary. I'm going to start abbreviating. And I can say that because of given. And step number 4, I can say the measure of angle 2, plus the measure of angle 3 equals 180. And the same reason we gave for step number 2. You can say supplementary angles add to 180. Alright, step number 5 here. Okay, so I want to eventually get angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So I can set, since these are both equal to 180, I can set those equal to each other. And go measure of angle 1 plus measure of angle 3 equals the measure of angle 2 plus measure angle 3. And this is transitive property. I'm using that 180 to transition. So transitive property. Alright, and now step number 6. Well, I have measure of angle 3 on both of them. I can subtract that, so I get measure of angle 1 equals the measure of angle 2. And how do we do this? We can do it through subtraction. Property of equality. Alright, so my next step, now I know measure angle 1 equals measure angle 2. Well, my last step here, I can just say angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And that's because if angles have the same measure, they are congruent. So angles with the same measure are congruent. And there's my proof. So I'm given some information that these are supplementary. I can actually go through those steps and prove it. Alright, here's another theorem. So if two angles are, I'm just throwing these to you. We're not going to prove it this time because that's a lot to keep showing. So it's something to read eventually. So if two angles are complements of the same angle, then the two angles are congruent. And this is similar to what we just did, except it's talking about complements that are 90 degrees instead of supplements, which are 180. It's probably going to be the similar process. Two other theorems, just to look it over and just kind of process this in your head and think why this makes sense. Maybe go ahead and prove it on your own, on your notes, just to prove that you can do this. This is a good practice. So all right angles are congruent. So if angle 1 and angle 2 are right angles, then we could say those angles are congruent. Another theorem, if two angles are congruent and supplementary, then each is a right angle, because that's the only way to make that work, because they both have to be the same measurement, 90, and they both have to add to 180. So practice that on your own. Let's do this example though. Pause the video. Alright, let's begin. So we're given angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. We want to prove angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So given these two, we want to prove these two are congruent. Okay, so let's start with statement 1. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. And this is, we are given. So that's a good start. Now my next step. Well, what can I do when I have congruent angles? Well, let's change it to measurement. So I can say the measure of angle 1 equals the measure of angle 4. And I can say this because I can go congruent angles have the same measure. Alright, so now step number 3. So what do I want to do from this point? Well, I can say you know what? I don't even need to say this measurement here. I'm actually going to go backwards. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. So sometimes you might go one path and you say, wait a minute, that's not the way to go. And that's okay. Just cross off your mistakes or erase them and try something else. So I got this given. Now I can say something else here. Angle, we know vertical angles, right? So we're going to use vertical angles here. I can say angle 4 is congruent to angle 2. Why can I say that? Because they're vertical angles. Vertical angles are congruent. And we know that. So now we can go to step number 3. Step number 3, and we're going to use the transitive property here. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And that's transitive property. We're using that angle 4 as the middleman there. So transitive. All right, let's move to the next step. Step number 4. Well, what else can I say? I know that angle number 1 and 3 are vertical angles as well. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and these are also vertical angles. So I can say vertical angles are congruent. And the next step here, well, I can use angle 1 as the middleman again with the transitive property and say angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. And this is because of the transitive property with steps 3 and 4. So transitive property. And that's it. That's what I wanted to prove. And we're done.